So for the write-up for this report, do refer back to the first two reports and our feedback that we've given you because they're more or less two pieces. The first one kind of concentrated on the results and discussion. The second one, a little bit more on the synthesis. Now you're doing the whole thing. So it'll be good to go back and look at the comments and things that were made on those two reports. You can go ahead and refer back to the detailed lab guidelines or what we went through in the first report for the distillation. For the chemical reaction in this particular one, make sure that you are doing the actual ester that you have determined that you came up with. So not anything general with the R groups, but make sure it is your actual ester and actual carboxylic acid and alcohol. So don't forget that you want to put the names of the structures and put the conditions on the arrow. And I'm just going to make a little picky comment that in your lab manual, yes, they do have the reactions and you can copy those. But please, oh please, put in that the sodium hydroxide is aqueous or put in that there's water involved because the way that it's written in the lab manual kind of infers that you're just dumping that solid sodium hydroxide into your ester. And I can just tell you that that would not be very effective. You can't really break with water if you don't have water, so let water be included in there somewhere. Make sure in the procedure that the two things that are reactants, so think about what two things go into making that carboxylate salt, which is the first thing that you make. Make sure that both of them are listed with their actual amounts and the millimoles in parentheses afterwards. It'll be kind of easy because we're sending it to you, and that means that those are about the only exact measures that you are going to be seeing. But just as a note going forward, anything that actually goes into making the product needs to have the millimoles and the exact amounts listed. The melting point needs to be included along with its literature value, the mass of the crystals you got, along with the yield in parentheses needs to be in there, and the NMR spectra needs to be listed at the end of the procedure in the way that we discussed in that last video. For the calculations particular to this experiment, make sure that you put in the limiting reagent. Clearly mark which one it is. So you're comparing the two things that are going into making the carboxylate salt. You need to make it clear to us which one you've determined is limiting. Show the theoretical yield, show the percent yield. Okay, so I'm going to spend most of the time looking at the results in the discussion and talking about how you handle that for this particular report. So again, you'll start off with a paragraph, just sort of introducing what was done, just a sentence or two to get you into the rest of the data, things that show that a reaction has occurred. And then you're going to start off by talking about what was done to determine the carboxylic acid product of this reaction. So a table for the melting points with the literature values for all the possible carboxylic acids that could have been. So take a look at your manual. There are 4 that should be listed in there, along with a line for the values that you got for your carboxylic acid melting point. Put a little text below that to explain which melting point matches the best and make a note on its purity based on what we talked about, tells you the purity of a sample based on the melting point. You're then going to go into how you identify the alcohol portion, the alcohol product. So include a labeled structure for the NMR, a table that shows the things that I've listed here. They're also listed in the detailed lab report guidelines, and I'm about to show a slide with this setup to drive that home. So all the pieces of the NMR analyzed and put into that table, followed by a text that describes how the information in this table describes the structure that you are showing. So well, I'll get into this when we talk about the next slide, I guess. So at the end of this one, you definitely want a summary paragraph because, again, your charge is to figure out the ester from identifying these 2 products of the reaction. So after identifying the 2 products of the reaction, take a couple sentences to explain how those 2 products describe the starting ester that you were identifying, why that is the case, okay? I wanted to include this. This is the way that you should show your NMR data. So a labeled structure up top, followed by a table with the individual components that you would have gotten from the spectra, and underneath a text that talks your reader through how the information describes the structure that you are showing. And so a good way to think about this, don't be writing a text to your instructors who have seen this 100 times over. I think that is a big stopping point, that you don't describe it in detail because you fear, well, we know what you're talking about. Pretend we don't. Or even better, pretend that you are writing this to one of your classmates that missed the day, that you are having to describe why this data describes this particular structure. And a good way for NMR is to go through signal by signal, explain what it's describing, what it is next to, and go one by one through it. This is a pretty simple structure. It may not have been the best example for this, but it hopefully gives you an idea of how you would discuss this and explain, again, the connection between what you see in the table and the structure that you have generated. You'll have a conclusion where you summarize the data, and again, just recap. What two pieces did you identify by what method? What ester does this mean they must have come from? Have a discussion about the yield and the purity of your carboxylic acid. And that will do for this particular report. And again, please go back and look at your comments and any feedback that you got from the first two reports to feed into this, and ask us questions if you have any.